In this second part of the lecture on volume rendering, we will discuss transfer functions. Recall that a transfer function consists of four one-dimensional functions which are defined over the scalar values. The four different functions correspond to the color components RGB or hue, saturation, lightness or brightness, and the fourth one corresponds to opacity or transparency. Opacity is often referred to as the alpha channel, and it is the inverse of transparency, often computed as 1 minus transparency. So here are four examples of transfer functions for red, green, blue, and opacity. Notice that the scalar values or density, as it is often referred to, map to red, green, blue, and opacity values between 0 and 1. As a simple thought exercise, let's think about how we would generate something like an isosurface. So essentially, for an isosurface, we need the object to be fully opaque and at a particular ISO value and transparent everywhere else. So we would need an ISO value. Let's say at the ISO value, we would need the opacity to go to 1 and maybe stay at 1, assuming that the region in the interior of this isosurface have function values greater than the ISO value. Else we would need essentially a delta function, a spike at the ISO value. So this is one way of computing or displaying an isosurface using the volume rendering pipeline. So a typical way to extract the isosurface is not using a delta function, but rather using a step function which is centered at this ISO value. In order to understand transfer functions, I encourage you to pick up your favorite data set, could be a synthetic data set, and apply different transfer functions using your favorite visualization tool and studying the results. So here is one synthetic data which is radially decreasing from 255 down to 0. Let's look at visualizations of this data under the effect of different transfer functions. So let's say we have a step function. We would get an isosurface. Of course, for this data, the isosurface is a sphere. The artifacts here are due to the low resolution of the data and nothing else. If the transfer function is modified to an incline, then you get a small halo for the low values, for the values that are lower than the value specified here. If we combine the two, then we get a halo for the inclined portion of the transfer function, followed by an inner core which is shown as an solid opaque isosurface. So far we have played only with the opacity and assuming that the color is uniform over the scalar values. If we now play with the scalar values, with the colors, and let's say assign a blue corresponding to the isosurface, then we get a blue core. Let's stick to this opacity transfer function and assign different colors. What we saw earlier was a blue core. Instead, if we assign a transfer function such as this with lower values for blue and green corresponding to the incline, then we get a blue core together with a reddish halo. So classification of the data into different regions plays an important role in the effectiveness of the transfer function or of the volume rendering. Like I mentioned, the scalar values are often called density. So each voxel actually stores a real value. This real value, let's say density, could have many meanings depending on the origin of the data set. It could be stress, strain, or temperature, typical from numerical applications, simulations, finite element methods. It could be X-ray absorption of a material, as is true for a CT scan, or it could be the magnetic spin relaxation property, as what you would get from an MRI scan, or it could be a material tag per voxel. In all these cases, we would like to assign different visual attributes to the voxels or the scalar values in the data. So for example, in an MRI data set, for example, MRI of a head, we may want to see the different parts of the head with different colors. And the way we would identify the different parts is via some segmentation applied on the data. So for example, the brain, we may want to see in a unique color, let's say pink and maybe opaque. We may want to see the skin and the skull for context essentially. So we may want to see this semi-transparent and maybe light brown in color. So we can see through the skin and see the brain. The eyes, for example, we may want to see opaque and maybe blue in color. So a combination of this generates the volume rendering as you see on the right. So the volume rendering on the right was generated using this transfer function that mapped the raw scalar values to the different colors and attenuation properties. Of course, this mapping was possible because of a segmentation applied on the input data that allowed us to identify the different materials or the different components. In simple cases, for example, like CT, each material or each region of interest would have a characteristic density range. For example, low values may correspond to air, as is shown here in the figure. Medium values could correspond to muscle and higher values may correspond to bone. Assigning different opacities and color to the three ranges would result in a volume rendering as we see on the right. So for example, the bone gets white and opaque values and hence shows up very clearly through the transparent air and the gray and semi-transparent skin or muscle. So here is a generic volume rendering pipeline. We will talk about two variants, the pre-shaded and the post-shaded pipeline. In a pre-shaded pipeline, the data is classified first using the transfer function into a color volume. Now this color volume is processed using a raycasting algorithm where we cast a collection of rays, one passing through each pixel on the image. This ray goes into the volume, and as we step through the ray, we interpolate the samples to find out the value at a particular location in the ray. So for example, if you have a ray such as this, and as it enters the volume, you sample the ray, and the values of color at this particular point is computed using an interpolation. We composite these colors to compute the color at the corresponding pixel. So these collections of pixels will eventually constitute the final image, which is written onto the screen and optionally stored. In a post-shaded pipeline, the order of classification and the interpolation is exchanged. So we essentially shoot rays directly into the scalar volume, interpolate the samples now rather than interpolating colors. And for the interpolated sample values, we use the transfer function to classify and hence shade, compute the shade, maybe using the Phong model. And these colors that are computed or shades that are computed are composited to give us the value at the corresponding pixel. And essentially generate the image as shown on the right. Now, quickly, the pre-shaded pipeline often gives blurry edges, whereas the post-shaded pipeline gives us crisp edges and more smoother images. The images look smooth, whereas the edges or the creases are crisper. Why is this? So here is a quick explanation. In a pre-shaded pipeline, let's say we have a boundary. The intensity would or the scalar value would drop off as a step function because of the high gradient across this surface. This is shown as black on the left. Now, if we classify first and shade, the color also behaves like a step function. The color volume also behaves like a step function as we cross the boundary. Now, when we interpolate this boundary, this step function results in a smoother step, and hence we get a blurred edge. In contrast, in a post-shaded pipeline, as shown on the right, we first interpolate the scalar values to get this smoother step, and later when we classify, the classification clearly distinguishes the surface, and we get different colors, and hence there is a clear change in color across the surface, and hence we get crisper shades, crisper edges. So often we prefer a post-shaded pipeline. Of course, this means that we would like to keep the data with us until we have generated the image. Coming back to the design of transfer functions, what are good ways of designing this complex function? we did say earlier that the histogram helps the user in designing this transfer function manually. The question is, what are different approaches for automatically or semi-automatically designing the transfer function? Of course, when we use the histogram, the choice is left to the user and it depends on the data values and the data types. A second option is to use the gradient and the magnitude of the second derivative. So this is based on the observation that our visual perception system is able to capture creases or surfaces very well. And the gradient essentially is a way to capture surfaces. So if we can highlight surfaces, we often do a good job with the volume rendering. So we can also classify the different techniques for designing transfer function by looking at whether user interaction is involved or not. On the one extreme, we could ask the user to design the transfer function from scratch. Of course, this means several parameters and only an expert user is able to do a good job. On the other extreme, no user interaction, in which case we would like to design the transfer function automatically. Of course, learning-based approaches come to mind. Now, these are not so easy due to the lack of training data available. Of course, in some limited settings, training data can be made available either directly or synthetically generated. And there is some success in the more recent years in such an approach. However, in general, an automatic design of transfer function is not a solved problem. Let's now move on to algorithms for volume rendering besides the raycasting approach that we have seen. Now, of course, the raycasting approach can be classified as an image order algorithm where we compute the value at each pixel one after the other, and each pixel corresponds to a ray. An alternate approach is to render the volume in an object order where the contribution of each voxel is computed by marching through the voxels one at a time and splatting their contributions onto the image. Alternately, the volume could be considered as a collection of slices. Each slice could be texture mapped and displayed onto the screen using carefully chosen blending operations. So this is a texture mapping based approach. Then there are approaches which follow neither order or a combination of both orders. For example, there used to be a technique popular called the shear warp technique, no longer popular due to the viability of raycasting based approaches. Let's talk about rendering modes. There are 4 major rendering modes when it comes to volume rendering. So these refer to the ways in which the color is accumulated. Now, in an X-ray mode, what happens is we like to sum up the contributions or the colors along each ray. So this is similar to how an X-ray works. So this sum could be either weighted or often it is unweighted. An extreme example is to highlight one particular ISO value to generate an ISO surface. We have already seen how to accomplish this. in specific applications where we would like to see blood vessels, for example, after a dye is injected into the bloodstream, we would use something called maximum intensity projection, where the pixel value that is the largest along the ray is highlighted. This works because the dye that is injected into the bloodstream shows up as a high intensity scalar value. Of course, in general, we would like to use a composite along the ray using a combination of blending and lighting calculations. This is what we would refer to as full volume rendering. Finally, let's look at various improvements that have been proposed in the literature. We are going to talk about only 2 or 3 here. There are several papers written on volume rendering, and this continues to be a topic of interest. Like I mentioned, the gradient could be used to emphasize surfaces. As you can see here in the series of images with no emphasis of the surface on the left, the surface being shown with opacity in the second image. Some of the surfaces shown using lighting with specular highlights and shown with some opacity and illumination on the right. So this idea can be taken further to design so-called 2D transfer functions, where on the one axis we have the scalar value, and the second axis, the y-axis, we have, so here the x-axis we have the scalar values, and the y-axis we have the magnitude of the gradient, and every point here refers to the transfer function. So it indicates the mapping from this scalar value gradient magnitude to color and transparency. So this 2D transfer function may be used to highlight surfaces, as is shown here on the right. For the tooth data set, the 2D transfer function can be used to assign different colors and transparency to the different parts of the volume in a way where the surfaces are highlighted. So in the case of the tooth, there are different structures such as the enamel, the root, the crown, and so on. Each of these surfaces show up as these parabolas in the plot, and they can be so these parabolas, and they can be highlighted by choosing different colors, one for each parabola. Critical points of the scalar function can be used to highlight interesting features in the volume. This has also been explored to design automatic transfer functions which highlight or assign higher opacity to critical values. Contour trees that we saw in the lectures on contour propagation and their generalization called Reeb graphs have also been used to design efficient and useful transfer functions. To recall, the Reeb graph tracks this evolution of isosurface connectivity or topology. So in the examples you see here, the colors indicate the scalar values. In this case, these are the height functions over these three models. the height is measured from the surface and goes from blue to red. On the right, for each figure, we also see the corresponding Reeb graph, which tracks the connectivity of the isosurfaces. We notice that in these cases, this graph does have cycles, and hence is different from the contour trees that we saw. This abstract representation of the contours or the isosurfaces can be used to design spatially aware transfer functions. So, for example, what we see here for the chest data set is the corresponding contour tree, and different arcs could be selected and assigned different transfer functions. So for example, we could choose arcs corresponding to each rib and assign them a different transfer function, let's say green, red, and so on. This allows us to highlight the different parts of this data. The same idea is applied here on this so-called fuel data, which corresponds to the fuel injected into a rocket chamber. So different parts of the chamber can be highlighted by assigning different transfer functions such as green and blue and so on. As you can see, these highlight the different parts of the volume. So we will end with this collection of advanced techniques for transfer function design. Like I mentioned, there is lots of ongoing work on volume rendering. Much of the challenge nowadays is on the ability to handle large and complex data, interacting with this data to highlight the features of interest, and to design useful transfer functions.